All right, my next guest, I love him. I've had him on my podcast. The driest wit of anyone I know, and one of the smartest brains, Dr. John Limansky.
Thank you, Brian. Alrighty, so thank you to everybody here for coming out. I remember last year was the first event, and you guys are really what makes us do the work that we do, so thank you. So I'm going to be talking about biohacking, a ketogenic lifestyle. And biohacking's become more kind of mainstream, but you might be asking yourself, why am I talking about biohacking at a ketogenic conference? So everything that we talk about, kind of modern lifestyle, Western diseases, really can be driven down into the mitochondria. And this is a slide of a mitochondria. So all the diseases that we talk about really are starting at this level. So before I begin, I have to tell you I don't have any disclosures, so I'm not paid by anybody, so that's good. And a little bit about me. So I'm an internal medicine physician. I did work in a hospital for a long period of time and started a podcast with Jimmy Moore called the Keto-Hacking Podcast MD, which we basically highlight a lot of the different biohacks that we use to kind of augment a ketogenic lifestyle. And so I'm very much an advocate for a ketogenic lifestyle, but also incorporating other things in your life to improve yourself at a cellular level. And why should we care about all this? So everybody has their own experience, their own life story. But as a society, we are in a pandemic, essentially. And so the CDC put out numbers from 2017. We have 30 million people with diabetes in this country. And even scarier than that, we have 84 million people with prediabetes, which we know essentially means that they have insulin resistance at that point. And for every year, we're losing $245 billion in terms of medical costs and lost wages, which I don't know how we're going to sustain that as a society, so I think it's important that we start addressing this now. So we're in Texas, and Texas, as part of the Deep South, has one of the highest rates of diabetes. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk is this. So we got it wrong. We told people that because you're obese, you get diabetes, you get insulin resistance, you get all these metabolic diseases. The reality is that obesity is a symptom of dysfunctional metabolism, and it's not the cause. So the way I look at health is a little bit differently. So we hear a lot about these terms like inflammation, fat deposition, insulin resistance. So I look at all these things in terms of the mitochondrial level, what happens. And so if you look at insulin resistance, which we hear about a lot, that really drives metabolic diseases, which we're now learning. Same thing with inflammation, and same thing with fat deposition. Being able to actually access your fat stores to utilize them or to not. And then on the outside, we have the biota, which basically, I put it on the outside because I don't know what to do with that information yet. There's a lot of data coming out, but I'm not so sure that we know what it means. So before I really get into it, and I will tell you that the topic of biohacking is so large that it's hard for me to do it in one talk. So it's very kind of broad, but I wanted to give you enough information so that you have a sense of some biohacks that you could do to improve your health. So the way I look at biohacking is making the environment work for you instead of against you, which means that in our chronic kind of Western lifestyle, we're inundated with stressors, chronic stress. And so how do you take that? Do you go into the mountains and become a monk or the Unabomber? No, you're going to want to try to figure out how to live your life, but actually make it so that you're not as stressed. And the second concept I want you to think about is something called hormesis. And hormesis is this idea of short bursts of stress. So our ancestors would have short bursts of stress, and they would respond to that. Same thing, let's say you go to the gym and you work out. Well, what happens? You're doing a big push and it's a hormetic stress, and your body responds by building muscle. Instead of what our modern Western society lifestyle, which is this chronic stress, kind of like being married to me. So biohacking tip number one. So this is my favorite biohacking tip because it's the cheapest, easiest one to do. And I will preface by saying that I assume that everybody here is already ketogenic or low-carb, high-fat. Because if you're not doing that, you can do all the biohacks in the world, and it's not going to make a difference. So let's look a little bit about different ways of doing intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding. So there's obviously time-restricted feeding, shorten the window, intermittent fasting, which is a little bit longer periods, alternate day fasting, And then there's also extended fasting, which I won't get into. Because what are we trying to accomplish? So at a cellular level, we're trying to make free fatty acids, which I think has been explained over and over again. But I think also it's important to know that it's not necessarily ketones. So we measure ketones, and Dave Feldman showed that that's a very small production of fatty acids. We use that as a proxy because we can measure it, and it's very helpful. But the reality is most of your organs besides your brain are using free fatty acids as energy instead. So let's look at kind of metabolically what happens. So a study out of Cell Metabolism looked at this, and obviously they used mice because we're kind of sadistic when we're doing research, but they looked at what happens at a metabolic level. And what they did is they did a very interesting study where they had 4 groups. So one, time-restricted feeding for a short window. The other could eat whenever they wanted. One group was fed, regular standard Western diet, and one was fed high fat. And what they showed was that all the markers of metabolism that we have been talking about, glucose, insulin, leptin, adiponectin, all improve with time-restricted feeding. Because the reality is each organ is very smart at knowing how to use the energy it needs. Something called energy homeostasis. It's going to use whatever energy it wants, and the rest is going to be stored as fat. And so simply doing time-restricted feeding, in the top they showed if you're just eating all the time, you're going to gain more weight, which makes sense. If you're doing time-restricted feeding, you lose more weight. And more importantly, because when we talk about weight, what are we really looking at? We're looking at fat. And so in the red there, that's on the right, time-restricted feeding, fat mass. So you're losing fat, you're not losing actually lean body mass. And as a percentage of that, you're losing a tremendous amount of your weight as fat, which is what we want. So to really kind of show it graphically, what happens? Obese mice that are able to eat whenever they want, well, what happens? Yeah, they get fatter and sicker, which is what we would expect. But actually, more interestingly, is if you time restrict them and just let them eat in certain periods of time, they're obese, but metabolically, they're not as sick. And why is that? Because our ancestors couldn't eat all the time. They didn't eat 6 times a day. So they would eat, they would feed, and then they would fast for an extended period of time. And so when people go through this process of being keto adapted, what it really means is that at a cellular level, you have to actually create the enzymes and the receptors to be able to burn fat. And in order to do that, you have to give your body periods of time where you're not eating. And so if you restrict them, they become obese, but they're metabolically healthy. So same thing with lean mice, which you would expect. If they eat all day, they're going to become obese. But if you time restrict them, still crappy food, they're not going to be obese. And then same thing if you do kind of the 5 to 2. So basically 5 days a week, you're going to be time restricted, and then on the weekends you go crazy. Same thing, they didn't get fat. All right, so that's great. So that's mice. So what happens when you do longer periods of intermittent fasting? So Walter Longo and his colleagues at USC looked at this quite extensively. And so what happens? Well, it's what you would expect, right? So you normalize your glucose, you decrease your insulin, you deplete your glycogen stores, which is what we want, and then we mobilize those fatty acids and make ketones. And so there is a misconception that you can make ketones and not lose weight. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are chasing those ketones without realizing that you can have as many ketones as you want and not necessarily lose weight because you're not doing intermittent fasting and allowing your body to utilize its own fat stores. So on the top is kind of your typical American way of eating, right? So 3 meals a day, 24 snacks, you're always getting glucose spikes so that you're never producing ketones. That's pretty typical. In the middle is basically alternate day fasting or 5 to 2 fasting. So what do you see? Well, what you would expect, which is glucose is normalized, ketones start ramping up, and then when you eat, obviously the opposite happens, which is very important. But you can also kind of mimic that same thing in a smaller fashion by doing time-restricted feeding, where you eat 18 hours of the day, when you fast 18 hours a day, and then you eat for that short window. Okay, so what do you do if you do alternate day fasting and you start incorporating endurance exercise? You get benefit, or is it about the same? And so a study here was very interesting out of obesity that split this up into 4 groups. One group did alternate day fasting plus exercise. One just did the alternate day fasting. One did exercise, and one just did nothing, sat on the couch and did nothing. And so what they found was by combining alternate day fasting and exercise, you actually decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease by 10%, which at the end of the day, yes, we are concerned about weight, but the number one killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease. And so obviously they split it up in terms of randomized so that they're all similar. And what they found, which was the most interesting, is that fat mass decreased mostly in the group that combined it, which makes sense, right? You're using energy and you're also fasting. But it was pretty significant to the effect that when you combine the two, you actually lost 5 kilograms of fat mass. The other ones, alternate day fasting, you lost a little bit, exercise, really not much, and then the control, as you would expect, nothing changed. And the other thing that was very important was what happened to the waist circumference. So one of the things that you'll hear me talking over and over again is about biohacking in a way that it's cheap so that you don't have to be a millionaire. One of the simplest ways of doing that is by doing a waist circumference measurement. And the group that did the combination significantly decreased their waist because you want to access the visceral fat that is metabolically active. That's the fat that you want to attack. Okay, so we're talking about people who are sick. What about people who are healthy? Another study looked at what happens when you do alternate day fasting, people who are not obese, what happens to them? And they are able to show even people who are healthy, you have an improvement in fasting insulin. What happens? Well, you start utilizing your own fat stores. So fat oxidation, obviously it's not linear, but it trends down. And you maintain your lean body mass, which was really what we want. Okay, so what happens on insulin action? Well, intermittent fasting tremendously impacts insulin action. And what happens is you increase glucose absorption, which decreases the amount of insulin that you need to produce. It also produces something called adiponectin, which is extremely important, and I'll talk about later. The other thing that I found very fascinating is we talk about leptin a lot, and you hear about leptin, and specifically leptin resistance in people who are severely obese. Well, leptin actually plays another part in terms of cardiovascular disease, and it's very pro-atherogenic. So Dr. Ali talked about what happens when you get damage to the endothelial cells in the blood vessels. Well, so what happens? You get a response, and that response is macrophages and foam cells that come and basically make a scar tissue. And then you get platelets that aggregate, meaning they clump together, and that's when you get your MI. So by losing weight, losing adipose tissue, you decrease your leptin, and you decrease the ability of platelets to aggregate. Also, adiponectin, which I talked about before, which increases when you burn through your fat stores, actually has the opposite effect. So it's an anti-atherogenic effect. And as you can tell in the research, as you lose adipose tissue, as you fast, what happens? Your adiponectin levels go up, your leptin levels go down, and something else called resistin is actually going down as well. So this is kind of a nice overview of what happens when you do intermittent fasting. And again, it's not an in-depth review, but basically what happens, you get decrease in your resting heart rate, which is extremely important. You get increased insulin sensitivity, ketone production in your liver, increased insulin sensitivity in your muscles, and you get fatty acid mobilization. A couple other things that I'll talk about later is what happens to inflammation. Well, inflammation goes down, so you get decrease in CRP, something called TNF-alpha, which is a major marker of inflammation, and then decrease in IGF-1. All right, so big concept, and again, this is a big overview, but pretty simple, stop eating. So, sounds simple, but it's actually quite hard. So, ways you can do it, well, time-restricted feeding. Try to not eat that breakfast. Don't do your bulletproof coffee first thing in the morning. Give yourself a little bit of period of time. Stop eating, 6 o'clock at night if you can. Do some alternate day fasting. Try to extend fast if you can. All right, so next, biohacking tip number 2. So I would say, and I would make the argument that sleep is probably as important as nutrition in terms of your overall health. So this is my youngest son, and I wish I could sleep like him. So I've told my story many times that I used to work late at night, overnight, 36 hours. And I have a very hard time with sleep, and so I focus tremendously on that. But sometimes I think we live kind of in a dystopian universe where the people, so this guy is from the 1800s, they kind of knew biohacking back then without actually knowing the mechanisms and why they work. And now we're trying to figure out, well, how is it that we get healthy again when all we have to do is look back in history? So what happens when you don't sleep? Okay, so sleep is one of the most important drivers of obesity and insulin resistance. And it works by a couple of neuroendocrine responses, which basically have an adverse impact on metabolism. What does that mean? Well, it means that your insulin goes up and your hunger levels go up. So a study looked at, very simple, one group slept for 8 hours and one group slept for 5.5 hours, forcefully restricted their sleep. And basically what they found was that the white dots are the ones who slept normally and the black dots are the ones that slept 5.5 hours. And so they both lost some weight, and this is over 2 days. But the group that actually slept 8 hours lost more fat, while the group that slept 5.5 hours actually lost more weight in terms of muscle mass, which is not what you want. Now, what else happens when you don't sleep very well? Same study, basically, when you don't sleep well, what happens? Your hunger hormone goes up. So everybody knows about this hormone that I call the gremlin. Basically, it makes you starve. It makes you so hungry, so you eat. When you don't sleep enough, this hormone actually gets stimulated, and it promotes the retention of fat, which we don't want, and it increases hepatic glucose production, meaning that you're producing more glucose because you need it. What else happens? Anybody here worked late at night, night shifts? So what happens when you work late at night? You're starving. And what are you craving? You're not craving fat. I mean, maybe now you are, but back in the day, I would sleep, I would work 36 hours, I would be ravenous, and all I wanted was sugar. So we know that sleep restriction actually makes you hormonally want more carbohydrates. What else happens when you sleep poorly? Well, again, I talked about leptin, and we talked about high leptin levels and leptin obesity. Well, actually, low leptin levels is associated with sleep loss, and it's more dangerous than leptin resistance. And is it like, okay, one night or multiple nights or a year long of not sleeping well? So a study looked at what happens when you restrict sleep for one night. And what they found was with one night of poor sleep, your insulin sensitivity actually worsens by 25%, up to 25%, in the liver and in your muscles. So basically what that means is you're not being able to utilize the glucose that you want. Anytime your insulin goes up in this sense, you're basically shutting off your fat store usage. So what else happens? So a lot of people will have a hard time with that last 5 pounds of fat just right here, the little pouch. I always call that the cortisol pouch because basically cortisol is one of the major stressor hormones that we need. If you don't have it, you die. But it's also impactful in terms of insulin resistance and maintaining that little pouch of fat that you have. And so a study looked at this and basically showed 3 groups. So one group slept normally, and that's the top group, and you can see the cortisol levels didn't change. The second group basically was made to stay awake until 4 a.m. and they could sleep from 4 to 8, and then that was it. So basically 4 hours of sleep. And their cortisol level went up by 50%. And then the bottom group basically wasn't able to sleep for 32 hours. And they had a 70% increase in their cortisol. And more interesting than that is it didn't go back to normal right away. It took about 2 days. So sleep is extremely important in terms of control, and it controls things metabolically, homeostatic control, and circadian control. Another thing that I didn't really mention, but is our modern society with the lights that we have, the iPad, the iPhone, all these tablets, we are constantly inundated with information, so we get out of this normal circadian control that we need. So what can you do? Focus on sleep. Simple things. You don't have to be a millionaire in order to improve your sleep. You have to darken the room, and I'm talking as dark as possible. You have to turn off your devices, and that means iPhones, iPads, TVs. They shouldn't be on, and they shouldn't even have their Wi-Fi on because that can disrupt your sleep. Us old farts, if we hear a noise, we wake up like that. Having white noise in the background can help to try to get you into that deep sleep, and then making it cold is helpful. The other thing too is with late night eating. So some of us like to eat that late night snack. Well, what happens? It actually suppresses melatonin production in your pancreas. And melatonin is something that you absolutely need to obtain those deep sleep. All right, so next tip, feel the burn. So I'm not a Danny Vega, I'm not Robert Sykes, but I think it's extremely important that we do some sort of resistance exercise to really augment our ketogenic lifestyle, right? We're not just trying to lose weight, we're trying to maintain that lean body mass. And because I'm from California, I had to quote Arnold. So what happens? So we used to think that in order to really kind of benefit from exercise, you had to do long, sustained 2-hour runs. Well, the reality is you don't need to do that. And so remember initially I talked about the mitochondria. So we want to develop as many of those and have them as effective as possible. And the easiest way to do that is by exercise. So this study actually looked at what happens when you do one bout of strength training. And it showed that you actually increase your mitochondrial biogenesis, meaning that you made more mitochondria. And it does so by activation of this gene called PGC1-alpha, which basically allows for transcription of more RNA, which you don't need to know about, but basically makes you have more mitochondria. And so what else do you need? Well, if you're exercising, you need more energy, right? So most people are going to be glucose dominant. Even if you're keto adapted, you're still using glucose as some fuel. So exercise, what happens? Well, you make more of these GLUT4 receptors, and GLUT4 is the receptor you need to basically bring the glucose into the cell. And if you look at energy metabolism, and we use the skeletal muscles of the legs because they're the most active, they're the biggest, a couple things have to happen in order to really utilize the glucose that you have. So number one, blood flow goes up by about 20 times. So you have more glucose. Because you have more glucose coming, it diffuses down a gradient. More on one side, less on the other side, it goes down. The second thing that I talked about is the GLUT4 receptors. Those are very important. You have to make more of them. And then basically what happens is, at the last step, the hexokinase, that's the enzyme that basically allows you to use the glucose and start energy production. Well, the biggest kind of area that stops people is when you have high glycogen stores, this enzyme basically is turned off. And so that's why people who do endurance athletics, they carb load. And what are they trying to do? They're basically trying to shove as much glycogen into their muscles so that they have energy. One of my favorite biohacks is to actually exercise fasted, because what happens, you burn through your glycogen stores overnight so that when you exercise, you're going to utilize whatever glucose and fatty acids you have. The other thing that we found very interesting is that we used to think you need to do a lot of exercise, endurance. The reality is that HIIT exercise, or high-intensity interval training, allows you to use glucose much faster. So green line basically at rest, and as you increase your wattage, meaning more power output, doing heavy-duty, hardcore exercise, interval training, you massively increase the amount of glucose that your legs take up, which makes sense, right? You're using your legs, you need more energy, and so your body's going to respond by increased glucose. So you don't have to do 2-hour runs. You can do 20-minute exercise and get some benefit of it. You don't need to know all these pathways, but I think it's important to show that what happens at a cellular level is that as you do these high-intensity exercises, you do this cascade of events that basically allows you to have more receptors so that you can utilize the fuel. All right, here's the downside, though. When you stop using it, you lose it, right? So, middle one is when you're really activated, and then as soon as you stop, within 24 to 48 hours, your glut expression goes down. So you got to keep it up. So that's great and all, but now we're at a ketogenic conference. You might be asking, why is this guy talking about glucose? So Finney and Volek actually looked at what happens when you're keto adapted. What's the actual mechanism that happens? And is there really a benefit of being keto adapted in their FASTER study? And so what they did is they took groups of very endurance, ultra endurance athletes that were in the top 10% of their kind of group, and they basically did a couple things. They did body measurements, made them run on a treadmill for 3 hours to see, do they preferentially use glucose or fatty acids as their energy? Again, remember, your body's really using fatty acids, not the ketones preferentially. So they stratify them so that they're basically equal, as good studies do. And they kind of made sure that their energy intake was really low carb, because there was a lot of studies out there that say they're low carb, And then when you look at the details, it turns out they're really not low carb. So they define it as low carb is less than 20% energy from carbohydrates and greater than 60% from fat, which I think most of us here would agree that that's a pretty good ratio. Well, what did they find? So fat oxidation, basically how much fat are they burning, which is what we want again. So the top line basically looks at the low carb group. And so you can tell that their fat oxidation was actually 2 times higher than the people who were high carb. They were using fatty acids preferentially. Up to 88% of their energy was from fat. So when you are keto adapted and you're not going to be obviously an ultra endurance athlete, but you start exercising, you will burn more fat. Conversely, on the bottom, if you look at carbohydrate oxidation, well, there really wasn't that much from the low carb group. Very, very little. But the high carb group, that's preferentially what they use. So basically what they were able to show is that when you're fat adapted, you will run on fat, which is what we all know. Interestingly enough, they also found that every single person in the low carb group burned more fat than the highest person in the high carb group, to the point where it was about 2.5 times higher. And the other marker that they looked at, which is something called glycerol. So when you look at fatty acids, you basically have a glycerol molecule and then the actual fat change. And so the glycerol is not well used by the muscles. And so you can use that as a proxy of how much fat is actually being burned. And as you can tell, in the top group, basically it was 2 times higher again. So they were using about 2 times more fatty acids when they were low carb. So I put this slide up because you hear a lot from people, well, I'm just going to use fat as my energy or glucose as my energy. Your body doesn't care what energy it gives it. It'll use whatever you give it. And the end result is basically the same. You're trying to get acetyl-CoA into the TCA cycle because that's how you generate energy. So big concept. If you really want to enhance your fat burning, start exercising. And again, it doesn't have to be these long, drawn-out sessions. Fasting exercise I have found to be one of the most beneficial biohacks. Doing HIIT trainings, short intensity exercise. Just walking. So if you walk after a meal, you actually utilize your glucose much higher. And then functional movement, simple things. Take the stairs, don't use the elevator, walk to the grocery store. I know it sounds crazy, but it works. All right, so biohacking tip number 4. One of my favorite topics. So I'm trying to convince Jimmy to do the sauna. Not this kind of sauna, but I think I might need to move to Finland because I like their quote. So, sounds good to me. So what happens when you do sauna? Why do people do sauna besides thinking that they're going in there and they're just going to sweat out fat? Well, that's not really what happens. But again, let's look at rats because we use rats before we use humans as guinea pigs. So this study looked at what happens to muscle mass. Again, I just talked about exercise and how you want more muscle mass in order to burn fat. So what they did is they basically took these rats and put their hind legs up so that they couldn't actually use them. And same thing like, let's say you break your arm and you're in a cast, you take it out and it looks like a little baby's arm. Well, what happens if you don't use it, right? Your muscles atrophy. And so what they did is they had 2 groups. One group basically didn't have any heat exposure, and the other one had heat exposure, but couldn't use their legs. And so when you have heat therapy, what happens? You form something called heat shock proteins, and you'll hear more about this kind of in the Twitter world. What these things do, and there's a lot of different basically mechanisms of action, but they allow for the proteins that we need to be uncoupled so that they can be used to make new muscle. Okay, great. So what else happens? Well, let's talk about glucose tolerance and insulin resistance. So again, the same heat shock proteins, different ones, but they actually showed that by doing heat therapy, you actually improve insulin sensitivity and increase glucose absorption, which is what we want again. So again, Dr. Ali talked a lot about cardiovascular disease, and again, we need to talk about it because our goal is not necessarily weight loss, it's to be healthy. So what else does heat therapy do? Well, nitric oxide is one of the most powerful vasodilators that we have. Basically opens up the blood vessels. And a lot of the diseases that we see these days, microvascular disease, the smallest blood vessels, if I go and do an MRI of many of you here probably, you'll see very, very small areas of basically small strokes. And unfortunately, that's because those little vessels are being damaged constantly from insulin resistance. We don't know that because you feel fine. Maybe you get forgetful. Maybe you stop remembering your wife's name, something like that. That kind of triggers that there is something going wrong. But that takes 15, 20 years before we actually recognize that. So a study actually looked to see what happens with nitric oxide production. I won't bore you with the details, but basically they stratified it so that it was basically the same type of people. And then they took one arm and put it in heat therapy, and the other arm they didn't. And what they found was that you increase the amount of nitric oxide production, which they look at initial peak, tremendously from 44 to 59. So you get a huge burst of nitric oxide, which dilates your blood vessels. And then it sustains itself for longer. So there's a peak, and then it maintains itself versus the group that didn't have that. What else happens? Well, far infrared or infrared sauna is even more powerful because, again, it impacts nitric oxide production through a pathway called eNOS. So eNOS is an enzyme that actually makes nitric oxide from arginine and sertraline. Same thing happens. You get dilatation of the blood vessels. It also inhibits platelet aggregation, which I talked about before. So you don't get that clumping. And then you don't get the proliferation of smooth muscle cells. Again, when you get injury to the small vessels, that's what happens. That's how you get strokes, heart attacks. So I like this graphic because it kind of tells you what happens with far infrared energy. So you get increased nitric oxide production. What happens? Well, you get new blood vessels, angiogenesis. These blood vessels bring more blood flow to areas that need it. You increase the blood flow for the vessels that are there. You increase insulin secretion, and glucagon goes down initially because you're utilizing energy, and you increase blood flow to the kidneys, so you improve kidney function. So everybody knows how Viagra works, right? So think of sauna as the Viagra of the body. Basically, you're dilating all the blood vessels. I got like 2 people left. That's good. Somebody uses Viagra here. So, again, you don't have to be a millionaire and buy your own sauna, but everybody probably has a gym membership. Most of them have saunas. There is a threshold. You have to do at least 20 minutes at least 150 degrees Fahrenheit in order to get benefit. And really, the studies that look at this say that you have to do at least 4 days a week. So it's not like you do it one time and you're all of a sudden going to be, benefiting from it. All righty. So we've talked about 4 of my favorites. The last one is my favorite one, and it's cold thermogenesis. So everybody sees this and gets pretty upset about the idea of it. So this is Dave Korzunski from Heads Up Health. So I convinced them to jump into Lake Tahoe with me, and we recorded it, and we're going to put it up so everybody can laugh at us, basically. But Dave can tell you, because he tracks his sleep for the Oura Ring, that was the best sleep that he had that he can remember. He got very good deep sleep, very good REM sleep. So again, everything that I'm talking about works synergistically to actually improve your health. If you do cold therapy, well, guess what happens? You sleep better. What happens when you sleep better? Well, insulin resistance gets better. So then you're not as hungry the next day. So it's a cycle that we need to break, which is our chronic Western diseases, and actually benefit from it. So Mark Twain, gotta love Mark Twain. So what happens? Well, can you jump in a cold lake one time and get benefit? Sorry, Dave, unfortunately not. So I kind of tricked you on that one. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense. You cannot do it one time and expect a positive outcome. But one of the studies that actually looked at kind of a review article to looked at all the review studies on cryotherapy. And I think cryotherapy is probably the best one to study because we can actually reproduce it, right? So you drop the core temperature very quickly in these chambers, and you do it for a very short period of time. So it's easier to basically do studies and make sure that they line up. And so what happens? Well, again, remember I talked about inflammation, and we talk about inflammation a lot. Well, what does that actually mean? And I know it's kind of hard to see, but basically what they found was that cold thermogenesis has a tremendous anti-inflammatory effect. The major marker of inflammation, which, again, we need inflammation. You get injured, you need inflammation to repair it, but you don't want this chronic inflammation that everybody has. So TNF-alpha and all the studies got markedly improved, and that's the major driver of inflammation. We talk about high sensitivity CRP, and you hear that a lot. Well, again, that got better. So I know Dave and Dr. Ali talked a lot about lipid profile, but yeah, actually there are improvements in lipid profile when you do cold thermogenesis. So what happens? Well, my favorite, and I underline triglycerides because, so each group, so there's 3 groups, and group 1 did 5 basically sessions, group 2 did 10, group 3 did 20. And as you do more sessions, what happens? Well, your triglyceride goes down tremendously. So group 3 went from 108 to 69, which makes sense, right? As Dave Feldman told you, triglycerides are basically your energy. So your body's utilizing energy, and it's going to do it preferentially in triglycerides. Same thing happens with, obviously, LDL goes down. And more importantly, look what happens to HDL. So in the group that did it the most, HDL went from 53 to 63. So this pathway is complicated, et cetera, but what I want you to take away from it is something called brown adipose tissue. So when babies come out, the reason that they don't shiver to death is because they are surrounded by this brown fat, this metabolically active fat. And we used to think that as you get older, you lose it. But the reality is the reason that we don't really have it anymore is because we don't need it, right? So all of us here, I mean, we're in 100-degree weather, but we are all in 72-degree weather. We go into our car at 72 or 63 or whatever you like, but we're never in really, really cold temperatures unless you're like Wim Hof and you go climb Everest in your underwear. So what happens, though, is you can reactivate this brown fat and actually use it to burn energy. And you do it basically by using fatty acids and something called UCP1. So UCP1, when you get down to the mitochondria, and you don't have to understand all this, but when you get down to the basic cellular level, this is where all the energy happens. This is where the magic happens. So when you produce energy, it happens here in the electron transport chain. And when you start exposing yourself to cold, you make a lot of these UCP1 channels. And basically what happens is you give off energy. So you burn heat in order to what? Warm your body, which makes sense. So the more you do it, the more you start burning energy all day without having to exercise, without having to do anything else. But if you combine it with all that, then you're really a fat-burning machine. So interestingly enough, these fat cells actually feel the temperature. So if you expose them to 31 degrees Celsius, they actually start making more of these receptors, which makes sense, right? And lastly, what else does it do? Well, it actually increases something called irisin, which is basically a big driver of inflammation in obese men. All right, so as with anything, once you start getting into things that are working, the pharmaceutical companies are going to come. And they're going to start looking for drugs that actually target this. And that's what they're doing. So they're making a lot of drugs that look at, how do I take advantage of this? And that's fine. I have no problems with that. But some of the more common ones, like phentermine, so that was a very, very popular weight loss drug. Problem is, killed people. So what I want you to take away from this at the end is, at the bottom, which I circled, which is what we all are trying to accomplish, right? So you're going to increase those UCP1 genes, which is what you want. So you're burning energy all the time. You're going to increase utilization of your fat stores, increase lipolysis, which is what you want. You're going to use those fats through beta oxidation, which is basically burning fat. And you're going to increase your metabolic rate because you're going to increase norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, if you do the right type of cold water immersion, goes up to 500%. And as you burn heat, you will know that you're burning real fat loss. And the benefit is that you're really addressing all these major issues that I talked about before, right? So by doing all these biohacks, incorporating it into a ketogenic lifestyle, what are you doing? You're improving your insulin resistance, which we want. You're improving your inflammation levels, which is what we want. You're using your fat deposition, right? You're using it. And you're improving metabolic diseases. And by doing that, you're going to improve your obesity. So, big concept, shiver the fat away. So, cold showers, do they work? Unfortunately, sorry, cold showers don't work. But I use cold showers as a way to get people primed so that they understand the feeling of being cold again. one of my favorites as I've been traveling here is ice baths, which I know you're the crazy guy who's going to the ice machine and basically breaking the machine like I did, but it works. It works. You can convince somebody to jump in a lake with you, which we're going to do that again. Or if you're a millionaire, you can do cryotherapy. So I hope I've given you some information as to what the answer might be to improve your overall health. While you're incorporating a ketogenic lifestyle, consider doing some of these things. If you're going to do one of those things, I would say sleep. But obviously, I'm preferential to all of them. So I'm just going to leave you with this. So I know we talk about weight, and we focus on weight because it makes sense. That's kind of what we've been conditioned to. But I want you to understand that if you really want to lose fat, and you want to get healthy, and you want to decrease all your inflammation, you really need to recharge your body's battery, which is the mitochondria. And if you do that, the fat will come off. Thank you. Any questions? Uh-oh.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
So a couple of things. You exercise in Houston, Austin, San Antonio, hot, humid weather.
Yeah.
Do you generate any heat shock proteins?
Yes.
So,
but it would have to be, on a day like today, where high humidity, high temperature. Yes.
So there's some advantage to us.
So interestingly enough, so yes and no. So in that regards, yes. But if you actually look at some of the studies, the fact that we are getting warmer is correlated, not necessarily causative, with increased obesity. So if you look at those charts where most people are obese, it's in the South.
It's in the South. Second question is that since exercise improves mitochondrial health,
yes,
does it increase mitochondrial health in the brain? Because exercise is one of the most important components at reducing dementia.
Right. Very good question. So absolutely. You get a couple things. You get improvement in BDNF as well as increased mitochondria, not necessarily in the neurons, but in the astrocytes. So the astrocytes are really the cells that are surrounding the neurons that are basically nourishing it. And so you do get quite a bit of mitochondrial growth. And if you do, let's say, photobiomodulation, basically infrared light to your head, you can increase mitochondrial growth there too.
Hi, Doctor.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time. So everyone, if you've got questions, Dr. Limansky will be over here. Thank you so much, everyone. Dr. John Limansky.